Greetings, metalheads, and welcome to No Nonsense Metal Reviews. I'm George, and today I'm back with another metal head-to-head. Another pointless exercise pitting two great albums head-to-head against each other for, as I say, no particular reason at all, other than, hey, it's a bit of a fun challenge. So, today's metal head-to-head in this standoff of the ages sort of, is inspired by the recent release of the most divisive album of the year. The latest 6 Feet Under album, Killing for Revenge, has once again, in the way that Chris Barnes and Cannibal Corpse or 6 Feet Under seem to do, well, exclude Cannibal Corpse from that equation. Let's just say Chris Barnes and 6 Feet Under seem to have a habit of completely dividing the metal community, the death metal community, between loving it and hating it. I happen to fall into the love it category, and I'm not afraid to say that. So I recently reviewed Killing for Revenge, Chris Barnes' latest effort, and the response was pretty polarizing. Some people love it. Some of you metalheads out there absolutely adore it. Some of you really seem to dislike it. And fine, each to their own. That's what makes our community so unique. That said, it kind of got me thinking, is it really that bad? Is 6 Feet Under that bad? Is Cannibal Corpse that bad with Chris Barnes in the band? Because I certainly don't think so. So it got me thinking, and that thought process spiraled. And if you want more chat and debate about 6 Feet Under and Killing for Revenge, go check out the recent review that I did. But it got me thinking. It got me thinking about the Cannibal Corpse first four albums to feature the great Chris Barnes, because in my opinion he's a great death metal vocalist, but it also kind of stretches into that fifth album. It stretches into album number 5 as well. It did get me thinking, is the Chris Barnes era as good as the George Fisher era? There's a lot more great albums to feature George Fisher. He's had a far longer run with Cannibal Corpse. But who had the better debut with Cannibal Corpse? Is it the band's 1990 debut album, Eaten Back to Life, which of course featured Chris Barnes on vocals? Or is it the debut feature for, at this point, former Monstrosity vocalist George Corpsegrinder Fisher with album number 5, Vile? What an opportunity for a metal head-to-head. We've got two brilliant Cannibal Corpse albums here. We've got the debut with Chris Barnes and George Fisher's debut with the band. Eaten Back to Life, Vile, head-to-head. Why? Well, I, for one, happen to be a big fan of both of these albums. I personally really enjoy both Eaten Back to Life and Vile. Vile was actually the album that I heard before Eaten Back to Life. This was one of the first Cannibal Corpse albums that I heard. In fact, this is the 25th anniversary edition with DVD. So this came out in 2007. I don't think I got it in 2007, but it was certainly not that many years later. I don't know, 5 or so years later. I can't even think. Where has the time gone? But this album, to me, has always been a bit of an underrated album, but a bit of a beast as well. A pretty sturdy, staunch album in Cannibal Corpse's catalogue. Of course, this album, Vile, certainly at the writing and demoing stage, it was written and intended to be vocally presented by Chris Barnes. Chris Barnes was the intended frontman still when this music was being written, and I believe when it was being demoed as well. I think, if I remember correctly, reading that there were demos circulating with Chris on vocals. But he left the band, Corpsegrinder came into the band, and then the rest is history. And they have been on a pretty unstoppable killing rampage ever since. All hail Cannibal Corpse. But I've always loved this album. I've always had a great affinity for it. Devoured by Vermin, the opening track from this album, was one of the first Cannibal Corpse songs outside of the Kill album that I heard. In fact, if I remember correctly, just to give a bit of my trivia, the first Cannibal Corpse album that I owned, definitely, and heard, was Kill. And then after that, it was, I'm pretty sure, Vile. And then it was Torture. I think I'm getting my chronology right there. So, you know, pretty solid albums. I mean, certainly Torture is an absolute freaking beast of an album. But Devoured by Vermin, what an absolute monster of a track. Still a live regular for the band. Just hearing Corpsegrinder's vocals, he sounds like a manic beast possessed there. Devoured by vermin. Bloodthirsty killers devoured by... Oh man, you know, that's just sinister stuff. Proper horror movie metal. And then it's just littered with deep cut gems. Of course, we'll show off the absolutely putrid, uncensored artwork there. Complete with phallus and all. Littered with great tracks, absolutely brilliant. Still at this stage, of course, produced by Scott Burns, the legendary. Mummified in Barbed Wire, another absolute crushing bulldozer of a track. And this whole album is just bulldozer Cannibal Corpse. But those first two tracks in particular, in my opinion, bulldoze more than the rest. Killer way, solid death metal there. The tracks in general are longer on this album, certainly longer than Eaten Back to Life, which is littered by shorter tracks. It's kind of, that's the characteristic there. But we get Perverse Suffering, which is a pretty monstrous track. Another sort of fan favourite and a bit of a classic, but you know, a beastly track. A little bit more technicality, shall we say. Certainly that's a noticeable progression between these two albums. Things on the surface sound like they've progressed a bit in terms of experimentation, a bit more technical flair thrown in there. Disfigured, absolutely disgusting and brilliant. Then we get a couple of tracks which are, again, I'm going to say they are more on the sort of slightly more technical, sophisticated leaning of savagery, which are Bloodlands, which is a great one, love that track, and Puncture Wound Massacre. Before we get another absolute beast, I mean, Relentless Beating is a very fitting title because that track is a relentless beating of a Cannibal Corpse track. Absolutely love that one. That's one of my highlights from this album, as is Absolute Hatred. I think that's another beast. Eaten from the Inside, putrid and disgusting. Orgasm Through Torture. Again, lyrically, that is absolutely revolting, but it's just pure, solid Cannibal Corpse. And the album closes out with Monolith, which is a pretty bold way to close out the album. Close out the album proper, anyway, because I think if you listen to it on YouTube or Spotify, I think it actually has the live DVD tracks included as well. So it's effectively just short of 40 minutes of disgusting, reliable death metal. But I think what really stands prominently at the forefront of Vile is Cannibal Corpse really coming into their own. This sound that we get here on Vile is pretty much, you know, give or take a few tracks and maybe a few albums that are a little bit more curved around the edges than others, a little bit less kind of abrasive and sharp. This is pretty much the sound that Cannibal Corpse have stuck with ever since. I love it. I think it's a great album. George Fisher, Corpsegrinder, what a vocalist. He was already a pretty renowned figure in the death metal scene by this point, and his vocal debut is strong. That guy has sounded pretty consistent ever since. Absolutely brilliant. The band has been consistent. George on vocals, absolutely brilliant. I love it. And this is an album that I routinely very, very, very regularly revisit. I happen to be a massive fan of the latter albums as well. As I say, sort of Kill, Evisceration, Plague, Torture, Skeletal Domain, Red Before Black, rather. You know, right up to our most latest offerings. Cannibal Corpse have been on a fine, consistent rate ever since. But then it begs the question, is this stunning album from 1996 as good as the album that broke them on the scene? Of course, they were already making their way. They were already renowned as a former Buffalo, New York, I believe it was anyway, if I'm remembering correctly. I could be getting totally confused, but former Buffalo, now firmly Tampa, Florida death metal band. They were already making their way. They were already known. But Eaten Back to Life is a freaking great album. I love this album as well. This is another one of my personal favourites. It's certainly within my top 5 Cannibal Corpse albums. That'd be a real challenge, ranking the albums of Cannibal Corpse. Poor. I don't think I could do it off the top of my head, to be honest, but this is easily a top 5 album for me. And I can remember, again, shortly after Vile and Torture, this was one of the next albums that I picked up. And for reasons unknown, maybe it was sort of lack of experience and knowledge of Florida death metal and Cannibal Corpse at that youthful age that I was, early to mid-teen, I was expecting that this album was going to sound very dated and it was going to sound old and it was going to sound, I don't know, a little bit weak. You know, it's 1990, the scene is still young, you know, a couple of years in. Wrong. Totally wrong. This album is a bulldozer. This is Cannibal frickin' Corpse absolutely steamrolling you down and reversing over you and doing it all over again. 100%. It kicks off with Shredded Humans. Soon as I hear that rumbling, gargling bass tone thundering through, that's it. I'm already getting primed to headbang. I'm getting primed to break my neck and then tear my spine out. Just freaking bulldozing stuff. And then Chris's vocals over the top. He sounds completely different now to how he did then. And I think that with these, certainly with the first 2 Cannibal Corpse albums, he had a pretty great vocal style. And then after that, with, you know, Tomb of the Mutilated and Into the Bleeding, definitely that's where he started to sound more like the Chris that we recognise today. That said, I still think that Chris is a great vocalist and I'll stand by that. But wow, what a way to kick off the album. Then you've got pure brilliance in Edible Autopsy. Put Them to Death. Reliable, heavily Scott Burns stamped, Morris Sound Studio produced death metal. You know, it's not too far removed from the, you know, early Suffocation or let's just go out there and say Deicide death sounding stuff. That classic death metal Morris Sound Studios style and sound that we were getting. It's not that far removed. That said, Cannibal Corpse, even at the very beginning, fronted by Chris Barnes, totally unique, sounded unique. They had their own style and sound from the off. I think certainly very much characterized by Alex Webster's bass playing and Paul Mazurkowicz's drumming. I think those are the kind of 2 really characteristic, Cannibal Corpse characteristic elements there. And of course, at this stage, we had Jack Owen absolutely ripping it up, you know, now reunited with Barnes in 6 Feet Under. Remind myself who else we had in the band at this stage. I'm having a bit of a sort of mental block here. Of course, yeah, Paul, Alex, Chris. Oh, we had Bob Russey as well on the other guitars there before Rob Barrett joined the band. Good player. Yep, can't fault at all. But Jack Owens, I don't know, that guy, he's got a good style. He's got a good sound. But certainly Paul and Alex, their style, their sound really characterizes it. Just bulldozing stuff. Scattered remains and splattered brains. Disgusting. Early, heavily thrash rooted, old school death. Absolute steamrolling stuff. Freaking love it. Then we get some really catchy freaking death in the form of Born in a Casket. That guitar tone, those ominous, sinister, creepy freaking riffs. I absolutely love it to bits. The Undead Will Feast, of course, great. Bloody Chunks, disgusting. Excellent, riff-tastic, plenty of groove. That's another characteristic of this album. Littered with groove, littered with hooks. It's early stuff, and I think the technicality that we get in Vile, we haven't got that sort of level here, but it's easily palatable. That's where you get that kind of association with the more extreme end of thrash, where it's still packed heavily with groove and headbang-worthy stuff. Absolutely. Bloody Chunks, and of course, lyrically, we get a nod to Bloody Chunks in Vile on, I believe it must be Orgasm Through Torture. I believe. I'll have to check that one. Or quote me if I'm wrong. A skull full of maggots. What a iconic beast that is. And then Buried in the Backyard. Pure mastery. Absolute brilliance. I freaking love this album, start to finish. Slightly short. I think this is about 37 minutes long. On this particular version, you get a live version of Born in a Casket, performed with George Fisher on vocals. And then this also has Pat O'Brien on guitar, and that was still Jack Owen as well. So, absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant stuff. I freaking love that album. It is a masterpiece. 1990, early on in the scene, but it's just a staunch symbol of Cannibal Corpse and Florida death metal brilliance. But which is better? Is it the sound that burst onto the scene, gargling and spewing and slashing of throats, with Chris Barnes front and centre, with his rather luxurious hair, as you can see, literally front and centre there, and I've just, of course, just realised, forgot to mention the kind of the scene trait of the Florida death metal world, having other frontmen from the prominent bands guesting. And of course we have Glenn Benton of Deicide and Francis H. Howard of Incubus guesting on Mangled and Skullful of Maggots. Little note there. Nearly forgot. But yes, is it the debut, or is it the much more sophisticated, progressed, technical, and I would say considerably heavier, certainly in terms of just a full throttle bulldozing warfare, death metal warfare assault of Vile. For me, I'm going to be a bit of a sour traditionalist, and I'm going to say that the album for me has to be between these two, Eaten Back to Life, the debut from 1990. And it almost pains me to say it because I really do love Vile. I think that the only issue with Vile is that it's got material that was obviously designed for Chris Barnes, and then it projects that image into your brain, and you think, I wonder how different it would sound with Chris on vocals. That said, it doesn't really matter, because what George does here, what Corpsegrinder does here with this album, is he pretty firmly puts his identity and his stamp on it. It's still Cannibal Corpse. There's no doubt about that. Vocals, very different. I would say that overall, Corpsegrinder probably is a bit more of an adept vocalist. But I don't know. There's a real charm to the early albums, certainly to Eaten Back to Life and Butchered at Birth. But this one, Eaten Back to Life, for me, I love it. Absolutely love it. It just pips Vile to that number one spot there between these two albums. So it's a firm runner-up. But Vile, I would say, maybe you're not familiar with it. Maybe you're more of a Chris Barnes era fan. Don't know. For whatever reason, if you haven't heard Vile and you haven't really given it a chance, check it out because it is crammed full of belters. For example, Devoured by Vermin, Mummified in Barbed Wire, Perverse Suffering, Relentless Beating, Absolute Hatred. Masterpieces. It's just that this one, Even Back to Life, is just packed full of groovy frickin' excellence. Shredded Humans, Edible Autopsy, Mangled, Born in a Casket, Skull full of maggots buried in the backyard. Disgusting stuff. Absolutely freaking love it. So for this pointless album head-to-head, metal head-to-head, for me, it's going to be Eaten Back to Life. But now just remember that's my opinion, and just as you're entitled to yours, I'm entitled to mine. To quote the great Lemmy, I got mine. Don't know why I needed to say that, but I got my opinion. What is yours? What album wins in this metal head-to-head? Are you more into the Chris Barnes era here? Are you more of a Eaten Back to Life kind of fan, kind of Cannibal Corpse fan? Or is it the disgusting Vile with that brilliant debut effort from George Corpsegrinder Fisher? Which camp do you fall into? Are you Eaten Back to Life or are you Vile? Let me know. I'm interested to hear thoughts and opinions on others. But of course, let's just keep this friendly, harmless, nonsensical metalhead fun. Keep this polite as far as you can, and as polite as you can keep death metal, of course. But very, very interested to hear the common consensus on this one. Is it Eaten Back to Life or is it Vile? Let me hear your thoughts and opinions. Thank you very, very much for watching, my friends. Please do feel free to like, subscribe, share, comment, support. It's all very, very much appreciated, so thank you very much. Do check back soon for more reviews and recommendations of all the good, heavy things. But until next time, my friends, take care of yourselves and stay freaking heavy.